This is England's Talkin' 0845 113 2222.
This is Hallam 2.
So this is England's Talkin'. This is Tom Davis. Thank you for your company today. Right, so general election on its way. There are those that are running for office who are very much in favour of a reform, a change in the law as regards recreational drugs such as cannabis. So to talk to us about this from Clear Cannabis Law Reform, Peter Reynolds. Good morning, afternoon, Peter.
Good afternoon, Tom.
The legalisation of cannabis, where does the country sit on a percentage basis?
Well, all the recent surveys show that there's a majority in favour of reform of the cannabis laws. I think there's a lot of confusion around the use of the word legalisation.
Yeah.
A lot of people interpret it as meaning a bit of a free-for-all, whereas most people who are on my side of the debate, as it were, are in fact looking for much tougher controls or more control over cannabis than we have at the moment. Because the truth is that we have no control over cannabis at the moment because the government has abandoned control of this £6 billion market to criminals. So whilst they would have you believe that they're trying to protect people and that they're, on a honourable and sincere path, nothing could be further from the truth. But the reality is
the situation that because in your words the government has abandoned what it can and can't do with this £6 billion industry, is the next move to reform the law, or would you think the next move would be to unabandon it?
Well, I think the next move is to take control of it. Ironically, cannabis is called under the Misuse of Drugs Act a controlled drug. But I simply ask you to look at the evidence. The market is worth $6 billion a year.
Yeah.
We consume 3.5 tons every single day, and yet it's a completely unregulated, uncontrolled market, which promotes human trafficking. It promotes the hijack of rental properties and the destruction of those rental properties for illegal cannabis farms. It promotes contaminated and what I call moonshine weed for sale on the streets by dealers who don't care what age the person they're selling to is. So what we need is a regulated system where outlets are licensed to sell cannabis. They're under strict regulations, so they can only sell it to adults, and if necessary, then ID must be produced.
Can I ask you straight out, would you like to see a situation where, whether they're licensed or unlicensed, shops in the high street where you can go and buy this drug to use?
I would not like to see a situation where unlicensed retailers are allowed. No, I wouldn't.
Okay.
I would like to see a situation where people are licensed and regulated, and they have to, pass some basic checks to make sure they're responsible individuals before they're allowed to retail cannabis.
Do you mind if I bring another caller in?
Not at all.
Dave, I think, was a former policeman. Hello, Dave.
Hi, Tom. All right.
I just asked you to join in the conversation with myself and Peter. You've obviously been listening.
Yeah.
I would hazard a guess that you, being a former police officer, you've got an opinion on this.
I have got an opinion, some quite strong opinions. I've been listening to Peter, and he makes some quite valid points in respect of the issues of unlicensed cannabis, young people getting access to it, and he made the point about where he'd be pretty pro for shops to sell it to adults, etc., etc.
Yeah.
There's certainly some valid points on that, but in the reality terms, and all the time that I spent on the streets, which was over 12 years, watching these young people being targeted and these networks build up, my concerns would be, which is the question, would we legalise cannabis? I would definitely say no. And the reasons why is quite simple. If we legalise it, first and foremost, what message are we sending out there? That's the first thing I would say. If we're saying, okay, well, there's a substance that we know that can affect you, we know that people can get addicted to, we know the issues about mental health and the links to schizophrenia and on depression, and all the other things that have been well advertised over the years.
Yep.
So do we just say now, because of the pressure and it is in the public eye at the moment, it's getting brought up time and time again, and the pressure on the government, which I know is quite immense at the moment, to look at this again.
Yep.
But is the answer just to say, right, okay, let's just legalise it because it's a bit of a headache?
Peter?
Oh, well, let me say those points in turn. I mean, first of all, the question of the links with mental health and schizophrenia, and as your caller Dave says, these have been well advertised. I think advertised is the right word, because these are largely myths. I mean, we saw a very interesting question in the House of Commons just a few weeks ago, where one of the main anti-cannabis MPs, Charles Walker, asked a question as to how many children had been hospitalised for cannabis psychosis in the last 5 years, because this is a popular scare story that the Daily Mail repeats endlessly. And when the facts actually came out, it turns out that there are an average of just 28 people each year for the last 5 years. Now, obviously, each one of those 28 cases is a tragedy. Don't want to take away from that at all.
But if it was available on the high street, that 28 would rapidly increase, wouldn't it?
Well, no, all the evidence is, if you look at markets where cannabis has been reformed, where the laws have been reformed, that in fact consumption by children in particular goes down. That may seem counterintuitive, but that is actually the evidence. For instance, the consumption of cannabis by children in Holland is much lower than the consumption of cannabis by children in the UK.
Well, let me read you
The fact
this.
of the matter is that, if there's only, as I say, each one of those 28 cases is a tragedy.
Yeah.
But this compared to the other causes of psychosis, it is a trivial, almost irrelevant factor in public health terms.
Let me read you this. Tell me whether you agree with it, and then I'll tell you where it came from. Cannabis can harm your mental health. Regular use is associated with increased risk of developing a psychotic illness, such as schizophrenia. A psychotic illness is one where you experience hallucinations or delusions, open brackets, when you believe things that aren't really true, close brackets. Your risk of developing a psychotic illness is higher if you start using cannabis in your teens, and if you have a family history of mental illness. Cannabis use has also been shown to increase a risk of relapse in people who have schizophrenia, or could make existing symptoms worse. Also affects
the way in which they're couched. It does increase the risk, but it increases the risk by such a tiny amount. What the scientists show is that to stop one person having a clinical diagnosis of schizophrenia, and you would have to stop a minimum of 5,000 people ever smoking cannabis at all in their life.
Right.
Now, that puts the risk into context. There are 1,000 people in total admitted to mental health institutions for cannabis use each year, adults and children, that is.
Yeah.
There are 3,000 people admitted to hospital each year for peanut allergy.
Yeah.
So that puts the thing into proportion. Again, there are people who will have a bad reaction to it, and that's a tragedy.
Yeah.
And as with any but that can happen with any substance.
Sure.
And what we need to do is we need to get this thing into balance and in proportion.
All right, let me bring Dave back in. Dave, your days as a policeman, my question's quite simple, and I've always put this to people like yourselves, to you, Peter, and to you, Dave. What is the desire within young people to reach out for the criminal element of cannabis? In other words, my question's quite simple. If there was, Peter doesn't want to use the word legalisation, but if I can go and buy it in the high street, basically that's what it is.
Legal regulation is what I would call it.
If I'm able to buy it in the high street from a licensed trader, that's one thing. But how many young people that you've dealt with over the years would then turn away from something legal and still want something that's against the rules?
Yeah, some good points. Again, I'm listening quite intently to what Peter has said. The brutal reality, I'm not a stats and figures man, because you see all these experts coming on with all these sorts of range of figures and this, that and the other, and a lot of them really can't be substantiated. I'll look at it on the brutal reality side of it. I've worked with parents over the years. For 12 years I've been involved with the education, training, doing student insets, parent evenings, training staff, etc. In relation to the cannabis, the stats, as I say, they're all over the place. The reality is, if you go and ask any parent where a young person, particularly at sort of 12, 13, 14, they might start dabbling with cannabis, which you generally do around about that age, if it's available, would tell you horror stories, absolute horror stories, where, and I can tell you firsthand, those that I've met over the years, not just with cannabis, that at the top end of the drugs trade, they've got addicted to things like heroin, crack cocaine, and I've sat in interviews and said, look, how did it all unfold? How did all this progress?
Yeah.
I would say in the range of around about 95% of those people that have ended up on these so-called highly addictive drugs have said they started using cannabis.
Sure.
Which is where you get the term gateway.
Sure.
And I don't know what Peter's view is on that, but
Dave,
Dave,
Peter, it kills me to say this because we've run out of time.
All right.
But if I come straight back to this, subject one next week, are you both available to come on?
I'd be happy to.
I'll be happy to as well.
Brilliant. We'll pick it up then. Cheers, guys.